Hey guys, hope you're doing all right. Today I want to look at a technique point, which is to do with 15-mark questions, AO2 questions. And I've noticed that this is an area where people do tend to find it quite hard to sometimes figure out what the question is asking. And because it's a different skill than a 10-marker, so a 10-marker is about knowledge, which is AO1, and a 15-marker is AO2, which is evaluation. Sometimes people have a little bit of a hard time separating those out and understanding actually what's required. So I want to do a little bit of decoding with you today, looking at what these questions are really looking for. And so I've thought the best way to go about this is to do a series of little mini plans for some different 15-mark questions, which I'll take you through and hopefully provide you with some phrases and a little bit of structure to help you find your way through these. All right, so I thought I'd start by looking at a few common mistakes that I see quite a lot. And this doesn't come with judgment, because I absolutely get why people make these mistakes, and they do it in a really quite well-intentioned way. But these are some things that you want to try and avoid in your 15-mark questions. So first of all, don't just write down everything you know. Don't pack them full of knowledge, because if you spend all of your time just regurgitating knowledge, firstly, that's not what's being asked for. And secondly, it's going to eat up a lot of time that you don't really have. Knowledge is your 10-mark questions. So by all means, in your 10 markers, unpack things as thoroughly as you can, but don't do that in a 15, because it's not needed. It's not what's being asked for. Stating different points of view but not doing anything with them, that's another thing that is a common mistake. It can be quite hard, particularly if you're still in a bit of a transitional phase from GCSE, to just really stick to this structure of on the one hand, on the other hand. And it's not necessarily that that's a terrible thing. You do need different points of view in your answer. You obviously do. But you have to do something with them at A level in a way that perhaps you don't quite so much at GCSE. So what you don't want to do is just say, on the one hand, some Christians think this, but on the other hand, some Christians think that. That isn't evaluation. That's just stating some different points of view. And that's not going to get you very far. To evaluate well, I think you have to reach a well-justified conclusion. And quite often I read conclusions that one of two things has happened. Either the person writing the essay has run out of time and it's ended up being quite rushed, and so it doesn't really say anything, or the person writing the essay has just not really engaged with it as an evaluation, and so their conclusion really doesn't do anything other than restate the question in a slightly different way. So you want to avoid that. And then finally, don't waffle. Sometimes people whose knowledge is a little bit shaky and who don't have the knowledge to really get into it and engage with an evaluation, they'll just try and pad. They'll just try and write a long essay so that it looks like they've done a good job, but actually it doesn't say anything. If that's you, if you recognise that in yourself, the best advice I can give you is do some serious revision, get your knowledge up to scratch, because then if you know what you want to talk about, you won't feel the need to waffle anymore. All right, so those are some things we want to avoid. So little mini plans. 15 markers can come in different, not exactly different flavours, but there can be different wordings of the question that come up. Sometimes there are some that are quite common to ethics. Some of them are more common to philosophy. I want to look at a few different bits of key wording that sometimes come up and just have a little look at how you could do a quick plan if you needed to. So I only spent about 2-3 minutes writing each of these plans. And that's all you're really going to have in the exam. That's really the most amount of planning time you're going to have, because obviously you need to get into your essay. So let's just have a look at this. So this is a year 1 Christianity 15 marker. Christianity cannot justify the use of weapons of mass destruction. So I would say the key AO2 phrase in that question is cannot justify. So the two sides of the argument are going to be, can it be justified? Can it not be justified? I'll say more about this on another one, but remember, you can take a position between those two. It doesn't have to be as completely binary as that. The other thing I would really spot in this question is the question is asking about the use of weapons of mass destruction. That's not the same as the possession of weapons of mass destruction. Is it possible that there could be a space where it could be justified to have them but not to use them? I think it would be fair enough to go there in this essay. So an argument to say that it can be justified is you can use Fletcher. Now you might be thinking, well, Fletcher's ethics, Fletcher's not Christianity, but situation ethics is a Christian ethical theory. So I think it's absolutely fine to use it here. You could apply Fletcher's thinking and say that even though it was awful, Hiroshima could be seen as agapeic because it ended the war, and therefore overall many scholars estimate that it saved more lives than if Hiroshima hadn't happened. Hiroshima and Nagasaki, I mean, which was the dropping of the 2 nuclear bombs. But that then gives you a window to do a bit of a criticism of that, because you could say, yes, on the one hand, Fletcher's thinking could be reasonable there, but the big problem with it is, can Christians possibly really be comfortable with the idea that mass killing is compatible with the teachings of Jesus? That won't feel right to many Christians, and you can absolutely draw that out, and you can give your own views. Lots of people ask me, is it okay in a 15 marker to say, I think, I believe, my view is? And the answer is yes, as long as it's justified and it's not just a standalone opinion. You can write in the first person, that's absolutely fine, but what you can't do is just spout your own beliefs with no relationship to the essay or no justification for what you think. And then on the other side, an argument that it cannot be justified. Jesus appears to have had a message that leans towards pacifism, so that's one argument that you can explore. But the counter to that is, can WMDs act as a deterrent and therefore actually contribute towards peace? The problem with that argument for this essay is that that's not really about using them, that's about possessing them. So again, I think it's okay to go there, but you'd need to make sure that you understand that and that you say that you understand that. All right, let's look at another one. Okay, another Christianity one. Jesus is a very important source of authority for Christians. So again, I'm starting with the key phrase, the key bit of AO2, which is very important. Now, obviously, what you don't want to do is just write down everything you know about Jesus as a source of authority for Christians, because that would be AO1. But what you do need to do is think about what other sources of authority are there. So if Jesus is going to be very important, that suggests that others might not be quite so important. So have that in the back of your mind when you're formulating your arguments. So if you want to argue that it's very important, you can go straight to this quote that you have to know from John chapter 10 verse 30, I and the Father are one. If we're taking that at face value, that suggests that Jesus's authority is God's authority. Now that's very convincing if Jesus really is God in human form, but that is far from certain, and not all Christians do see Jesus this way, which could undermine that view of authority. And then to flip it, on the not so important side, Jesus's words may not have been accurately recorded by the gospel writers. So again, you could use the same quote, I and the Father are one. That's not written down by an eyewitness. That was written down much, much later. It may have been mistranslated, it may have been misremembered. So we can't know exactly what he meant. But the thing is, you can then say, well, if that's true of Jesus's words, that could be true of all of the words in the Bible, and that could possibly undermine the authority of the Bible in general. That's the way that I would do it. There are other ways of doing it. So what I don't want you to take from this video is the idea that I'm telling you exactly how to do it and that only this way will work. With a 15 marker, with AO2, this is critical thinking. So there are always going to be lots of routes through a question. All I'm trying to do is model some ways you can do it. Moving on to this one, ethics. Aristotle's virtue ethics is not a good way of making moral decisions. So our key phrase is not a good way. The conclusion doesn't have to be binary. So I mentioned this before, but I think it particularly relates to this one. The conclusion doesn't have to be that it's a good way or it's a bad way. You could land on a conclusion that it's good for some things, but not for others. It's good for certain issues, but it depends on how it's applied. So on the one hand, it's a good way of making decisions because it's flexible and it's character-based, so it's not so restricted by rules. And you could draw a little bit of a comparison with something like natural moral law, where the rules can sometimes be a bit restricted. But the downside of it not having rules is it's vague. It's not always very easy to interpret. And then you can also build on that and say it's not a good way of making decisions because it's outdated. Aristotle lived such a long time ago in such a different world that some of what he says just doesn't really work anymore. And you could use his example of saying that stealing is base. He could never think of a good reason for somebody to steal. And actually, I think as a virtuous person today, stealing in general might not be virtuous, but you could think of times when it would be. But again, you can respond to that and say these things are not a problem because virtue ethics can easily be reformulated for the modern world because the concept of a good character is universal and timeless. Aristotle's good character might not look exactly like our good character, but good character is good character. That's not a concept that goes out of date. All right, I know I'm rattling through these, but I want to just give you a flavour of some different questions and some different wordings of questions. So here's another Christianity one. This is year 2 Christianity now. Christian views of marriage are outdated. So out of date or outdated does come up from time to time. And I think the best way to translate that in your head is to say, does it work today? Or does it no longer work today? So on the one hand, you can say it's outdated because society no longer demands that couples are married. That's not a major social expectation anymore. You can make it a little bit about gay marriage, but I wouldn't make the whole thing about gay marriage. You can use it as a point to say that many societies permit gay marriage. In many parts of the world, Christianity hasn't got there yet. So that could show Christianity as being a bit out of touch, a bit outdated. But the response to that can be, in the Bible, marriage is marriage and it's between a man and a woman. Now, not everybody absolutely agrees with that. But for what the Bible does say about marriage, we have to sort of see that that's where it is. And therefore, if there's a biblical basis for it, we can't just make it mean whatever we want. Could also argue it's not outdated. It's a sacrament for Catholics. So sacraments can't be changed and redefined. It's, you know, God making a change to your soul, and that's never going to go out of date. Marriage still brings great benefits to the people who enter into it. But you can also take a slightly feminist perspective here and say that biblical marriage was much more transactional. It was, you know, marrying for love was not really a thing in the Bible. Marriage was to do with providing for people, particularly for women, but it did not always respect the rights of women. And you could say that our views in society on that have changed quite dramatically. So do our views of marriage need to change as well? Okay, last one we're going to look at, quick philosophy one. The design argument has no value for religious faith. These come up quite a lot, particularly with areas of philosophy and particularly with the arguments for God, actually. So your key phrase is has no value. I want you to think about the different meanings of value. So is it that it's convincing as an argument, or is it that it helps in another way, or is it that it's actually a bit pointless? Now, a fideist is someone who has faith because they have faith. They believe because their faith tells them things. So fideists tend not to be very interested in reason or logic or arguments. So something like the design argument is not going to have any value to a fideist because they believe because of their faith. Arguments are just a bit pointless to them. But on the other hand, it could have value because even though it might not convince somebody to become a Christian, what it might well do is strengthen their existing faith. It may clarify why they believe what they believe. And just a little shout out here to this concept of belief in versus belief that, because I think this is one of the areas where you could make it work. You could say it's possible to believe in the reality of a loving creative God without having to believe that Paley got it completely right and that every part of his argument is true. Belief in belief that you can use in quite a lot of ways. You can particularly use it with something like the resurrection as well, on obviously not here, on a different kind of question. Because you could say you can believe in the message of Jesus representing eternal life without necessarily having to believe that every detail of that story is historically true. Okay, thanks for sticking with me so far. Just to finish, here's a little bank of what I think are quite good phrases when you are trying to evaluate. So if you check your 15-mark essays for, obviously not all of these at once, but maybe 3 or 4 of these in an essay, that will help you to make an argument rather than simply stating different points of view. So look at these phrases, try and incorporate them into your writing, try and particularly incorporate them into your conclusions, and hopefully that will lift the level of your writing. Thanks very much for listening. Hope that's been helpful, and I'll see you soon.